Hey everyone, I'm Jessie, a 24-year-old ceramic artist and small business owner. Welcome to my small business, Third Day Clay, where I make and sell my pottery. In this video, I'll be showing you 3 different ways you can make stamps out of clay to use in your pottery. I'll be going through 3 different methods, a coil method, a carving method, and a slip trailing method, and giving helpful pointers at each step. I'll also show you how I use them in my most recent collection of work. Alrighty, let's get into it. I hope you enjoy! Some of the materials that you'll need are a ruler, a knife tool, a carving tool, a needle tool, a paintbrush, a wooden knife tool, wire cutters, a sponge, a rubber rib, a rolling pin, and a slip trailing tool. First off, let's talk about prepping these stamp bases and handles. You're going to want to roll out a slab of clay at about 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch thickness. Make sure to compress the clay with a rubber rib so no cracks form and so your base can be smooth and sturdy enough to add clay designs onto it. Here, I measured out the bases of my stamps. First, I measured and cut out squares and rectangles since I wanted to have some stamps that kind of looked like tiles. Keep in mind that smaller stamps are going to be easier to use for your pottery than bigger stamps. It was trickier to use the longer rectangular stamps that I made. They worked, but they were just a little bit more finicky. I made some circular stamps as well. It's probably not the best template to use, but here I used my watch to get the size circle shape that I wanted. I switched to a bottle cap after, which worked great, so you can just use whatever you have. To make the stamp handles, I rolled out a piece of clay into a coil and cut them up into pieces that were about 1.5 inches long. I set both the stamp bases and the handles aside to dry a little before attaching them together. To refine the shape of the stamp bases, I evened out the edges a little bit with a knife tool and then went in with a sponge and smoothed out the sides so the edges were smoothed over and so they didn't stick out in the design of the stamp. I also rolled out some thin coils and set them aside to use later when attaching the handles to the stamp bases. The first method of making ceramic stamps is the coil method. I've found that this method is the best for stamping into ready-made forms because of the depth of the coils in the design allow for a cleaner, more crisp-looking imprint. While it's the best looking stamp technique in my opinion, it is the most tedious technique, so patience is definitely required here. With this method, I decided to recreate the same stamp that I made in high school for one of our projects we did with ceramic stamps. This bowl was one that I made in high school with a stamp that inspired this whole idea to make ceramic stamps. Shout out to my high school ceramics 1 teacher, he was the best. To start, I rolled out a thin coil and started forming it into the shape that I wanted. I made sure to slip and score the base and the coil really good so it adheres properly and doesn't crack off when it fires. To make sure the design is nice and secure on the base, I used a needle tool and a wooden knife tool to blend the coil into the base. Remember that this process is long and tedious, so just be prepared to spend a lot of time doing this. I kept blending and shaping until I got the design that I wanted and used a combination of tools to achieve the look that I wanted for this design. Before blending the coils into the base, it might be helpful to let your piece dry a little bit after attaching your coils so the slip can harden and adhere more to the base. I jumped straight into blending and it probably would have made it much easier for me to let it sit out a little bit before jumping into blending. I also use this patching spatula tool to smooth out some of the rough surfaces. Use whatever tools you need to get the look that you want. This one was really helpful to flatten out some of the surfaces on the stamp. For For this design, I also rolled out little balls of clay to add in between the lines. This was the most frustrating part. Working with something this small is pretty challenging. I wanted to keep a good bit of this footage in to show just how long this process can be. It's a long process, but very rewarding, so just keep at it. It's just blending and smoothing, blending and smoothing. So, you got it. After that, when both the stamp base and handle are leather hard, it's time to attach them together. Here, I made some slip on the base and the top of the handle by spraying water and scoring it until I got the desired texture. I like to make sure I'm thorough with it here because I want the handles to be secure on the bases. I set it aside to dry for a bit so it's easier to blend later. Once the slip had some time to harden and secure the two parts together, I started by blending out the seams. I wrapped a thin coil around the seam and blended that out to be certain that the handle is reinforced and secure. To make sure the depth of the coils on the stamp were even, I lightly tapped the design on the table to even it out. I also pressed the design into the table and then cleaned it up again with a needle tool. And there you have it, the first stamp is complete. The next method is the carving method. If you want your design to stick out instead of being indented into the clay, this is the method for you. The most important tool here is a carving tool. I used a small one from Diamond Core Tools. First, I lightly drew out the design on the base of the stamp with a needle tool. Once I had my design ready, I started carving it out. The trick when carving is to get pretty good depth with the tool. It was a little tricky to get an even line width all the way through some of my carvings, so it might take some practice. If you want a thin line design, you can try carving with a needle tool. It's a little bit finicky doing it this way, but I would suggest to carve and let it firm up before cleaning up the lines. Once it's dried out a bit, you can scrape the surface with a fettling knife so it gets rid of any raised bits, and then go back in with a needle tool and clean out the carvings if it's needed. I added the handle and cleaned up the stamp before setting it out to dry. Once these stamps were bone dry, I cleaned them up even more with the wet paintbrush. And there you have it, your second stamp is done. The next method, the slip trailing method, is a fun one. For this, you'll need a slip trailing bottle with different precision attachments and then some slip. To make slip that's good for slip trailing, you're going to want to cover some bone dry pieces of clay with water, let it sit for maybe a day or so, and then put it through a fine sieve to get all the lumps out. Make sure the consistency of the slip is thin enough to flow through the nozzle, but thick enough that it keeps its shape. Then all you do is add it to the bottle and start slip trailing. I used leather hard stamp bases, but for slip trailing, I'd say wetter bases probably work better. Sometimes if the base is too dry, the slip won't adhere, leading to cracks or pieces flaking off. When making this type of stamp, you want to make sure to build up the height of the lines so it can make a deep imprint when using it as a stamp. To do this, I slip trailed my design, let it sit for a little bit to firm up just slightly, and then went back over the lines to build up the height. It shrinks as it dries, so just make sure to keep that in mind when making these. I try to even out the lines with the top of the slip trail tool as much as I can so that there's less refining to do later. If you want sharper lines on some of your slip trail designs, you can use a needle tool to sharpen up some of the edges. The last step before attaching the handle is to go in with a sponge after your design firms up to get rid of any unwanted bumps or texture. And that is it for the third and final stamp method. And now on to firing. I fired these stamps to cone 04, a bisque fire. If you're using stoneware, firing them to cone 04 leaves them porous, so it's easier to use as a stamp. If you fire these stamps so that they are fully vitrified or non-porous, it might stick to the clay when you go to use it as a stamp. Firing it to cone 04 allows for the stamp to soak up some of the water from the clay, making it easy to remove from the clay surface. They are slightly more fragile at cone 04 than when you fire it to the peak temperature, so if you end up breaking any, which is what I did here, you can use epoxy to glue it back together. Now that we got our stamps all finished and ready to go, I'll show you how I used them in my most recent cup collection. The first way I used them was on a slab of clay. I rolled it out, compressed the surface, and started stamping away. Once I filled up the slab with stamped designs, I cut them out, let them dry a bit, cleaned them up with a sponge, and slipped and scored them onto some cups. The second way I used these stamps was pressing into the cups themselves. The type of stamp that worked the best was the coil stamp. I put a smaller cup inside the form that I was working on so the stamp had something to press into to prevent the cup from tearing or breaking. You can use a glaze bottle or other hard surface on the inside as well. I did try to press one of my carved stamps into a cup form, but it unfortunately did not work. Because I had to apply more pressure to get the design to show up on the cup, it ended up cracking the rim. So I'm sure you can find a way around this, but I just decided to use this type of stamp only for the slab method. And here are some examples of my finished work, so maybe you can get some inspiration from them. For the stamped cups, I used a glaze that highlighted the stamps because of the variation in color. Glaze that varies in color will be best for these stamp marks. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and that it gave you some inspiration. Be sure to check out the other stamp video that I made on lino cut stamps for your pottery. Okay, that is all. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Now go out there and get creative.